Wipe the land clear, bring the ending, topple the empires to bring a fresh start, call the end, fill with memories of the land. This is the translation that Feldon the archaeologist made of the mysterious glyphs engraved on the inside of the Golgothian Silex, ancient artifact utilized by Urza to unleash massive destruction and end the Brothers' War on Dominaria in 64 AR. Feldon had come into possession of the artifact in 34 AR inside the inner walls of Phyrexia city on Phyrexia in northeast Dominaria. From there, the Silex left Phyrexia city with Lauren. It was then retrieved by Ashnod, who handed it down to Taunus, who, in turn, delivered it to Urza. You don't need me to tell you the ending of this story. The great Phyrexian artificer followed Ashnod's instruction and unleashed the power of the Silex to disintegrate the highland of Argoth, crushing Mishra's forces and winning the Brothers' War in the process. But how did Urza unlock the colossal power stored within the Silex? Ashnod's instructions simply were, fill it with memories of the land. A land that, by that time, was tormented, heavily disfigured, and devastated by years of constant war. This was the great secret behind the detonation of the Golgothian Silex. There was no powerful spell, nor secret mechanism, but rather the focusing of one's magical energy towards the unfair pain and destruction that the natural world had had to endure. However, in 4562 AR, more than 4,000 years after the end of the Brothers' War, Teferi Akosa knew nothing about this. The only thing he was interested in was finding a way to repel the second Phyrexian multiversal invasion of his own plane, Dominaria. And so, Teferi traveled 4,498 years back in time, to the exact moment in which the blast had been triggered. He did so to speak directly with his long-past mentor and find a way to save his world. But for now, let's start from the beginning. Teferi Akosa was born in the year 3293 AR in the ancient kingdom of Zhalfir, in the northwestern region of Yamura, which was one of the major supercontinents on the plane of Dominaria. Not much is known about Teferi's childhood other than the fact that, at the age of 14, he was recruited by Berun to study at the prestigious Tolarian Academy on the island of Tolaria. The academy had been founded by the great artificer Urza in 3285 AR, and its goal was to gather and train the young and promising mages of Dominaria to prepare them for the fight against the world of Phyrexia. Because Phyrexian sleeper agents could not disguise as children, the academy only took in young boys and girls at that time. Moreover, this was also a way for Urza and Berun to mold their students from a very young age to perfectly shape the backbone of Urza's crusade against Phyrexia. Teferi was a prodigy. Although he often misused his genius to make silly pranks to bother his fellow students and laugh at them. It was during this time at the academy that Teferi first met his lifelong best friends, a young Jhoira, for whom he initially had a terrible crush, the silver golem Karn, and Berun, the archmage. After Teferi's arrival, things proceeded smoothly for a few months, but then tragedy struck. In 3307 AR, a Phyrexian sleeper agent managed to infiltrate the school, exploiting Jhoira's loneliness. Tragically, Jhoira herself was killed, and the majority of the academy was destroyed in the Phyrexian attack that followed. Grieving for his only friend, and also in an attempt to save the academy from destruction, Karn, who was able to traverse the fabric of space-time, utilized Urza's temporal disruptor to travel back to the past and save Tolaria. While the golem was initially successful in his task, Urza's device wasn't able to handle the stress and collapsed, causing a big explosion and a far greater catastrophe for the island known as Karn's temporal sundering. Within seconds, Tolaria became plagued by temporal anomalies. Teferi's tunic was caught in the fire originating from the initial explosion, and the young mage was caught in a slow time bubble for decades. Although for him it was mere hours, the fire slowly spreading through his body as Jhoira spent years trying to figure out a way to free him. The solution to the problem came 23 years later, in 3330 AR, when Jhoira, aided by Karn, devised a method to safely cross the temporal barriers. Somehow, the water flowing from both slow and fast time bubbles retained its temporal properties, and by steaming such water through a particular device and into the bubbles themselves, it was possible to create traversable bridges that lasted for only a short time. Teferi was finally saved, but he soon began feeling heavily alienated. The world he knew had drastically changed. While only a few hours had passed in his bubble, entire decades had passed him by on the outside. While he was still both physically and mentally 14, his peers had become adults. He resolved to remain at the academy and close to Jhoira and Karn, who, during this time, truly became his closest friends and advisors. For years, they conducted their research together, reaching their apex in 3346 AR with the discovery of the Thran Mana Rig's secrets, which allowed for the creation of potent artifacts known as Power Stones, needed to fuel Urza's devices. With time, however, Urza's stubborn exploitation of his students and those who relied on him to achieve his personal aims progressively saddened Teferi and tainted the opinion he had of his mentor. His time at the Mana Rig then brought forth previously unseen leadership traits in Teferi, and when his homeland called to service, the Blue Mage answered. The next time we meet him, Teferi has brought peace to his nation. Sort of. The truth is that this part of the lore is a bit garbled, because the events around Mirage have been twisted and distorted by an unofficial lore website from the 90s that, although it wasn't, was considered canon for years. I'll leave a link to Multiverse and reviews articles on Mirage in the description below if you want to have a look for yourselves. However, this is what we know for sure. Teferi did indeed bring peace to his homeland Zhalfir and the conflict afflicting it. Shortly after, Jhoira arrived aboard the skyship Weatherlight to deliver a group of refugees from Serra's realm, the plane that Urza had sacrificed to power his interplanar traveling ship. In the same occasion, having missed Jhoira's company and feeling affection towards her, Teferi proposed, but Jhoira gently declined. We then learn from the backstory of Mirage that, sometime later, Teferi established 5 guilds of magic, each aligned with a single color of the spectrum to entrust them with the protection of Zhalfir. The Blue Mage then retired on his personal, isolated island to begin making experiments on time magic and phasing. However, during one of these experiments, something went terribly wrong, and Teferi accidentally phased his own island out of existence. In addition to that, this extreme event also caused Teferi's Planeswalker's spark to activate, and he planeswalked away through the multiverse, but the exact date of this is unknown. 3 leaders from 3 different nations, who also happened to be 3 powerful mages, all sensed the stream of energy unleashed by the island's phasing and headed towards the place to investigate. Mangara of Karundor, Kervek the Merciless from Urberg, and Jhoira Empress of Beasts from Zhalfir all met where once stood Teferi's Isle. Soon, the disagreements and strifes between the 3 became evident, and to maintain the peace they called a preemptive truce, which was later broken by the same Kervek who sought to conquer the entirety of Yamura. The warlock from Urberg tricked Jhoira into helping him confine Mangara into an amber prison, and then, in 4150 AR, he launched a full-scale invasion of the continent and the Mirage War began. Teferi was absent during the vast majority of this conflict and returned to Dominaria only around the year 4194 AR. During his travels and research, the Zhalfir mage had understood that the damage he had caused by phasing his island out of the timestream had to be repaired at all costs to preserve the temporal balance of the whole multiverse. For this reason, Teferi could not directly intervene in the Mirage War, but he nonetheless sent visions across the continent to aid heroes and leaders of the resistance, guiding them towards victory in the defeat of Kervak in 4195 AR. A short time after the war then, Teferi traveled to Mangara's home in Corondor only to find himself embroiled in the Planeswalker War. The Planeswalker War was a tremendous yet still mysterious conflict that took place in Corondor from 4195 AR to 4205 AR. The exact details of this war are still unknown. What we do know, however, is that many of the survivors went on to battle the first wave of the Phyrexian invasion a decade later. Also, around the year 4205 AR, back in his role as Royal Mage of Zhalfir, Teferi played an important part in the Prophecy War, successfully leading his people against an invasion from the warlike nation of Keld. When Teferi's forces struck the final blow against the Keldorians, the Blue Mage couldn't help but noticing that unknown illnesses and a mysterious corruption had been following the Keldorians' wake. Immediately understanding that the Phyrexian invasion was once again upon Dominaria, Teferi solemnly vowed to protect his people, even from his mentor Urza, if necessary. "I will guard my lands and the people who look to me, but I will never follow Urza. I will make my own way." Perhaps the single most important event of Teferi's story arc happened during the first wave of the Phyrexian invasion. The Royal Mage of Zhalfir helped Urza sealing the planar portals pouring Phyrexian soldiers into Yamura, but he did so only to harness an immense amount of energy that he needed for the spectacular spell that he was about to conjure. Refusing to let Zhalfir be yet another expendable pawn to Urza's sick game of vengeance, Teferi decided to forge his own path. Using a perfected form of the same magic that had once caused the catastrophe on his own island, and contravening direct orders from Urza, Teferi faced Zhalfir out of time-space, leaving a huge void in its stead. His plan was to return to Dominaria in a century, long after the Phyrexian threat had been dealt with. In the meantime, his beloved Jhoira had also grown wary of Urza, so Teferi accepted to phase out her homeland Shiv as well. Teferi and Jhoira emerged from the phased-out Shiv 300 years later, in 4500 AR. What they found, however, was not the same world that they had left. Dominaria had been reduced to a barren wasteland, but not because of Phyrexia. Urza had indeed succeeded in his quest at the cost of his own life. Something else had happened. Multiple planar cataclysms over the course of millennia, including the phasing of Zhalfir and Shiv from the temporal stream, had ripped several time rifts into the fabric of the plane itself. Even worse, soon after his return, Teferi couldn't stop the ancient dragon planeswalker Nicol Bolas from manipulating Venser, Akosa's young protege, into resurrecting him. Teferi found the first glimpse of hope towards resolving the situation in Radha, heir to Keld, a young elf-half from Keld who somehow had a connection with the time rift over her homeland. By exploiting this connection, Teferi tapped into meditation and had a revelation on how to mend the rifts. Then, beginning with Shiv, he anchored himself to the rift and successfully sealed it, but at the cost of his own Planeswalker's spark, which was lost as energy in the process. Bewildered by his newfound mortality after millennia, Teferi lacked the magical power to seal other rifts too. As if this wasn't enough, then the Planeswalker Jeska had been manipulated into using Radha as safeguard as she closed the other rifts. Before Teferi could bring back Zhalfir, Jeska used Radha to seal the rift caused by the phasing and condemned the whole kingdom to be forever trapped outside of space-time, way beyond Teferi's now mortal reach. Losing his homeland took a huge toll on Teferi. And even when the Great Mending of Dominaria, the process of rift's closure brought forth by Jeska, was completed, the rebirth and rejuvenation brought forth to the plane could never truly alleviate his guilt. In the years that followed, Teferi wandered through the plane of Dominaria. The past continued relentlessly to haunt him, and his legendary name was sullied by some as the man who had destroyed Zhalfir. It wasn't until Teferi met his future wife, Subira, and single-handedly raised their daughter, Niambi, that he could finally find happiness once more. Although he could never fully recover from the scar left by the loss of Zhalfir, Teferi's family anchored him, and with time, he slowly began to heal. With time, Teferi also resolved to pursue secrets left behind by his former mentor Urza, hoping to find something that could somehow help him restore his homeland. In 4560 AR, 6 decades after the Mending, a now middle-aged Teferi was approached by his old friend Jhoira and a group of young and bold Planeswalkers who called themselves the Gatewatch. Okay, so at this point you might be wondering, wait, if Teferi and Jhoira were both present at the Academy's destruction in 3307 AR, and given the fact that Jhoira is not a Planeswalker and Teferi lost his spark for a short while, how the heck are they still not dead due to aging? And that would be a pretty nice question. Well, as for Jhoira, she had become nearly immune to the passing of time as a side effect of her time bubbles experiment at Tolaria following the disaster. As for Teferi, instead, well, it turns out that losing your spark does indeed make you a mortal being again, but it also allows you to retain an unnaturally slow aging, although not as unnatural and slow as Jhoira's. Anyway, recognizing in the Gatewatch the same audacious soul that he and his friends once were, something rekindled in Teferi. Soon after then, Jhoira offered him a small power stone she had built in the Thran mana rig, and that, shockingly, contained the essence of a Planeswalker's spark. Contrary to what you might be thinking, this was no easy choice for Teferi. The man had profoundly changed from when he had lost his spark, and accepting to become again a Planeswalker was a heavy burden for him. But Teferi had a heart for adventure and, more importantly, he had unfinished business. On Ravnica, Nicol Bolas was plotting an endgame that Teferi could help this young Gatewatch to stop. Then, his lifelong friend Karn needed aid in confronting the emerging new Phyrexian threat. Teferi was in debt with the Multiverse, and anyone who'd seek to arm it would soon learn what this 1200 years old master of time was capable of. After he regained control of his spark, Teferi traveled with the Gatewatch to Ravnica for the final confrontation with Bolas. Immediately after arriving on the plane, however, Teferi became trapped due to Bolas's use of the Immortal Sun. If you wish to know more about this, make sure to check out my Rashka Complete Lore episode. Then, alongside many other Planeswalkers, the Royal Mage of Zhalfir fought against the Eternals of Bolas's Dreadhorde for the salvation of the entire multiverse. In particular, Teferi's contribution was vital to the Ravnican forces as he slowed down time around the planar bridge, functioning as doorway for the invasion of the plane, thus greatly delaying the unstoppable advance of Bolas's army. Moreover, during the actual conflict he used his time-bending magic to save the lives of many Planeswalkers and Ravnicans alike, possibly, according to Jace Beleren, saving more lives than anyone else that day. When during the Eternal's onslaught, the Gatewatch and Ravnican leaders got together to strategize on their next moves, Teferi, together with Jace, Jaya, and Vivian, volunteered to assassinate Liliana Vess, who had been compelled by Bolas to serve as commander-in-charge of his Dread Horde. Thanks to Teferi's time-warping magic, the four Planeswalkers almost succeeded in their mission if not for Bolas' intervention, which ultimately saved Liliana's life. Eventually, thanks to the betrayal of Liliana herself, the forces of Ravnica managed to win the War of the Spark, and Teferi was also present during the plane-wide celebration that followed. If you wish to know more about this, I suggest you to watch my Liliana's Complete History video to find out exactly how the war played out. Teferi then participated to Gideon's memorial service on Theros, and there he met with Karn and Ajani Goldmane to strategize on how to assist the Silver Golem in his plans to help the Mirren resistance on the plane of New Phyrexia, formerly Mirrodin. As the three are discussing what the best move against New Phyrexia could be, Kaya of the Orzhov Syndicate returns to the Gatewatch and Ravnica from the plane of Kaldheim to deliver important information about Vorinclex. Indeed, Kaya had been hired by a mysterious benefactor to hunt down what turned out to be the green New Phyrexian Praetor, Vorinclex, on the plane of Kaldheim. Before she could complete her mission, however, she, together with Tyverkel and Nico Aris, got dragged into the plans of Valki, the god of lies, who was working to stir up war between the various realms of Kaldheim. Kaya, Tyver, and Nico managed to avert Tybalt's scheme, but Vorinclex was able to flee back to New Phyrexia in the meantime. As Kaya began recounting what had happened, however, another character made his entrance on the stage. It was the red and green werewolf planeswalker from Innistrad, Arlen Cord, who had come seeking aid from the Gatewatch. Cord desperately needed help in recovering the Moonsilver Key, a sacred vessel instrumental to enact the ritual of the Harvesttide Festival, which was supposed to restore Innistrad's natural balance between day and night. Indeed, after Emrakul's imprisonment on Innistrad's moon at the hand of Nissa and Tamiyo, the day and night cycle of the plane had been greatly affected, bringing all sorts of problems and turmoils to Innistrad. After hearing her out, Teferi, Chandra, and Kaya decided to delay the hunt for Vorinclex and help her. The trio, aided by nature witches called the Dawnheart Coven, managed to find the Moonsilver Key, only for Tovolar, the Darpak leader, to unleash his werewolf on the festival and interrupt the ceremony. Tovolar was the main antagonist of the Midnight Sun storyline, and his main aim was to exploit the eternal night caused by Innistrad's moon to seize power and dominate the entire plane. Amidst the chaos of the attack, Olivia of the Voldarin bloodline makes his arrival and is able to steal the key, also killing the head witch in the process. Olivia's aim was to use the key to control Innistrad angels and assert her control over Innistrad and all its vampire families. Eventually, the Gatewatch and the Resistance Coalition launched an offensive onto the Voltaren estate during the celebration of Olivia's wedding to Edgar, the Charmed Groom. The Moonsilver Key was recovered and the ritual was completed at the Celestus, thus bringing the Eternal Night to an end. At one point during his stay on Innistrad, Teferi also encountered Ren, a Dryad planeswalker who could symbiotically bind with the Treefolk, and, after some initial misunderstanding, the two became good friends. Teferi arrived at Oyster Bay on Dominaria in 4561 AR, as the peace summit between two major nations was taking place, the Keldans and New Benalia. As the Blue Mage was reporting the new Phyrexian incursions on the plains of Kamigawa and Kaldheim, However, the negotiations were disrupted by a group of Phyrexian agents who launched an attack on the summit, forcing Teferi to flee alongside Jhoira, Karn, Jhoira, and Sten to the new Argive watchtower. While attempting to secure the tower against other Phyrexians, Teferi was severely injured. The Phyrexian sleeper agents were much more numerous than what Teferi and his friends had initially thought, and even Sten, in an attempt to finish off Teferi, revealed himself to be one of them, but only to be swiftly killed by Karn and Jhoira. With the Phyrexians closing in, and not many options at their disposal, Karn called upon the Weatherlight for help. The skyship arrived soon after. Teferi was pulled to safety and healed by Rathwin. Then he spent the next few days recovering his strength on the mana rig with Jhoira and Karn, and helping them to recruit more allies to fight off what now clearly configured as the second Phyrexian invasion of the plane. After he was fully recovered, then, Teferi served as the new coalition's general and quartermaster, leading the full resistance army against Praetor Sheoldred's Phyrexians in the Battle of the Mana Rig in 4562 AR. The Battle of the Mana Rig was the single largest battle that took place during the new Phyrexian invasion of Dominaria. In it, a completed Ajani Goldmane disastrously killed Jhoira Ballard. Karn was abducted and his Silex neutralized, and Sheoldred's forces ended up overrunning the rig completely, forcing the coalition's surviving troops to flee. It was a huge loss for Dominaria. A defeat so extremely heavy that almost every last bit of hope was lost with it. And so, with the Phyrexia multiplanar invasion imminent and threatening the entire multiverse, Teferi, just like Urza millennia before him, rallied numerous Planeswalkers to strengthen as many planes as possible. Determined to destroy Phyrexia once and for all, Teferi's goal was clear in his mind. He would have used Karn's Silex to finally wipe Phyrexia out of existence. There was only one minor spark in his plan though. He had absolutely no idea on how to activate the Silex. That knowledge had been lost since time immemorial in the folds of time, and there was no way to uncover it. Or was it? Desperate for answers, Teferi had a desperate idea. He enlisted Saheeli Rai to construct a device using the technology stored in Urza's tower that would have enhanced his time manipulation powers so that he could travel 4,498 years back to the past. Back to when he'd be finally able to find the answers that he was looking for. Back to the first Phyrexian invasion of Dominaria. Back to the Brothers' War. And so, Saheeli Rai designed and built the temporal anchor, which, however, required an immense amount of energy to function properly. For this reason, the legendary device implemented the skyship Weatherlight's own Power Stone core as an engine, and Teferi was forced to fight a Phyrexian completed Ajani over it. Once Ajani was dealt with and the Power Stone core retrieved, everything was ready. Saheeli skillfully operated the machine, and Teferi was sent back through the fabric of time. Their first attempt proved unsuccessful, as the Blue Mage landed to the year 85 AR at the onset of the Dark Age and therefore not far enough in the past. The second attempt sent into the Fall of Krug in 28 AR, which was far too back. Finally, Teferi located Urza's detonation point in time just prior to the final Phyrexian assault on Urza's tower in the present and traveled back to that exact moment. With so little time, and no clear explanation that could be inferred by reading the glyphs on the inside of the original Silex, Teferi froze time to briefly converse with Urza immediately after the Silex blast had been triggered and 64 AR. His former mentor revealed to the mysterious time traveler that, in truth, there was no secret spell nor lost instructions for the activation of the artifact. It was simply a matter of personal sacrifice, he said. As Teferi was about to ask Urza what he meant by that, the power stone core of the device overheated and damaged the Anchor itself. As the hordes of new Phyrexia were marching on the tower, Teferi's consciousness was lost in the time stream, and Teferi himself lost track of reality. Hey everybody, thank you so much for watching this episode of Planeswalkers 101, this time featuring Teferi, the time warping mage from Zhalfir. As always, if you like what I do, please make sure to subscribe to the channel, comment and like this video, share with your friends. I'll also have socials where you can follow me if you want to. I'm a new channel and your support has truly helped me out. So thank you all so much again for watching and for having been here with me. My name is Octopus, and I will see you in the next one.